Okay, hey guys, welcome to today's AP Gov stream. So while we wait for a couple more people to join, why don't you guys go ahead and give me something that you're looking forward to on Friday? Because today's Thursday and we have a day left until we can call it a day for more days of school. That was an interesting way to word that one. Okay, also there is a poll, and the question is, do you agree with your parents' politics? And so you'll understand why this is the question I'm going to ask in a couple of slides, but there's three choices: yes, no, and kinda, which would mean that like you don't completely agree with how they feel about politics, but there are things that if you were talking to them, you would be like, yeah, maybe you're right. Okay, so I'll give you guys a few seconds to answer the poll. And okay, let's get started. So, welcome to the Fiveable stream today. We're going to be talking about political socialization and political ideology. And so I'm your host. My name's Fatma Raja. And before we go any further, make sure if you're not already following Fiveable, all of their social media platforms, it's at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube. So you can find them that you're looking. And here is the things that we are going to be talking about. So on Monday, we are going to have another current events stream, and it's going to be at 7:30. And because AP Gov always streams on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you guys make sure that you tune in next week too. So before we go anywhere else, a little bit about me. My name is Fatma, and this year I'm a senior, and I'm planning on being a liberal arts major. So yeah. So first, we're going to talk about agents of political socialization, and we'll get into what those are in the next slide. And then we're going to talk about characteristics and political ideologies and how they influence each other and interact. So before we get any further into the stream, why don't you guys drop some things that shaped your political views in the chat? And so this can be anything from like, I read a lot of news on Twitter and I think I agree with these people, to my mom and my dad talk to me about politics and I think that I agree with them on a lot of things. Okay, so Sandra says her parents. Yeah, so I would also generally say that my parents were a very big influence on how I feel. Cheyenne says that the media she consumes is something that's super important. Okay, so let's talk about how both of those things are completely valid. So first, we need to understand what exactly political socialization is. And so the definition of political socialization is it's how people formulate their ideas about politics and acquire political values. So pretty much in layman terms, Sandra says she watches Trevor Noah. Okay, completely fair. So, okay, so political socialization. So it's how you begin to view the world in the way you do. So for example, you can think about it like culture, right? Like in America, we have a different culture if you compared it to another country. So for example, in like a country like Pakistan, right? So they have different standards. So whereas in America, it might be completely normal to like wear like a tank top or something, that's something that's like not necessarily common in a country like Pakistan in some areas. And so that's pretty much how political socialization works too. The people who you're around and whose politics you oftentimes hear about, you're more likely to grow up and view the world in the same way. So let's talk about what some of those agents or people will be. So the first is your family. And this is very largely the biggest thing that's going to influence influence how you view your politics and the world overall. So one of the big things is tradition. So a lot of times people say that they're lifelong Republicans or lifelong Democrats. And so this oftentimes influences their children, because if they grow up hearing those things being talked about in between adults or parents when they're discussing things, whether it be at the dinner table or like when they're watching the news, that influences how their child is going to grow up and like view it. So when we think about the family and how they socialize people politically, it's not like anything where they're sitting children down and just brainwashing them or like explaining how they view the world and politics to them. It's usually something that happens where children are listening to what their parents say. And so it's not a direct like conversation that happens, but it's just something where like by association, children develop their parents' political views. And so that also happens when they're like talking about elections. So like coming up the 2020 election, people might hear their parents talk about it, and they will very likely agree with what they say if they're very young, because they pretty much don't know anything but what their parents are saying. Yeah. So that's how the family is very largely one of the biggest influences on how we begin to view the world and how we're social politically. So the second is school. So school is also a very big influence on how like we're socialized politically. So students begin to start learning about the political process, right? So you start voting for class officers, and when you get to middle school and high school, you start running for club offices and voting for who those officers are going to be. And so that kind of teaches you a little bit about the political process. And so when you think about it, you're like being socialized to begin voting from a very young age and view your participation within a club and its elections as something that's important. In addition to that, you also begin to learn about American history. So the way that your teacher teaches history and gives you context allows you to form deeper opinions about the things that have shaped America. So for example, in some states, there's not as much of a focus on like the civil rights era. So people might not view that as a significant part of history in some places. But in other states, it's a very big focus. And so we learn that the civil rights era was a very important period of history where people of color really had to fight for their rights. And so the rights that we have today are based on the struggles that others faced for us in the past. So in doing so, in classes, oftentimes teachers have like discussions or debates. So you begin to interact because not everyone's parents have the same worldviews, right? So if everyone is beginning to be in this one area and talking about pretty much how their parents have felt about politics for their entire lives, there might be disagreements. So you begin to engage with your peers and talk about how you guys view the world differently. And so that's a way how school begins to shape how you're going to view politics and the rest of your opinions and how they're shaped in the long run. And another influence is peers. And so they aren't usually seen as a major influence, but there are some factors that can make your peers have a larger influence on your politics. So if your peer group is more diverse, you're also going to tend to be more accepting of like different viewpoints, because you already know that people in life disagree. So that's something that like shapes your politics as you get older. And so when we say peers, usually what we mean when it comes to political socialization is occupation. So when you think about it, teachers tend to have the same political opinions as other teachers, and bankers tend to usually have the same opinion as other bankers. And so this becomes incredibly like common for their opinions to like agree when it's about their specific profession, right? So teachers tend to support like overwhelmingly increasing funding for public school education and resources, right? And comparatively, bankers and people who are working on Wall Street tend to agree and support lower taxes or having less regulations on things like trading stocks, right? So when we talk about peers, it usually has to do with people who are like working with you, not necessarily like your friends. Although you might find yourself like hanging out with people that have the same political views as you, but there aren't usually like a huge influence, and your occupation tends to be like one of the more defining factors of your political socialization. The last thing is media. So like earlier how Cheyenne said that the media she consumes is an important thing that has shaped her politics, that's something that completely makes sense. So the media that you consume, it's pretty much how you're going to view the world, right? Because obviously different news sources may have different biases. And so how you like are consuming those specific biases will largely inform how you end up seeing the rest of the world, right? So because a lot of people nowadays get their news from the internet and the TV, like the way socialization happens is changing in a lot of ways, because like 50 years ago, not everyone would hop onto Facebook for their daily dose of news, right? So there's things that are also changing. And so the way that people like have commentary on social media can also influence your beliefs. Because if you follow a bunch of, for example, Democrats on Twitter, you might see different things compared to someone who only follows Republicans on Twitter. So pretty much how people view the world and how you choose to consume media influences how you're going to view the rest of the world. And guys, make sure if you have any questions, drop them in the chat or click the Ask a Question button, and so I can get to it as soon as possible. And so also when we look at the media and we talk about how more people are consuming their news through social media, something that's becoming a larger issue is misinformation. So a lot of the times it's really easy to like have a tweet go viral, and because it has something that's super like controversial or like incendiary. And then it's not as easy to correct it. So a lot of people might see the tweet where it's like this huge issue or scandal or something, but not a lot of people will see the correction that's like, oh, fact check, we actually found out we weren't right about that. So misinformation is becoming a larger issue because people actually end up seeing what's like actual factual news. Okay, so now that we've covered what we have in terms of like just hardcore, like what influences how you view politics, let's talk about some of the characteristics that like people have in common when they identify with a party. So here I have made a very convenient chart that if you want to copy down, like feel free to do that for your notes. But these are a lot of the common things that people have. So we have 3 columns here. The first is trait, and so that's going to be like the characteristic that people like have. And then we're going to sort it into a likely Democrat or a likely Republican. So for gender, a lot of the times to be more likely to identify as Democrats, and men are more likely to identify as Republicans. And when it comes to income level, low-income people are more likely to identify as Democrats, and higher income people tend to identify as Republican. And so when you think about that, it might make a lot of sense, right? Because when you look at the Republican Party's platform, they tend to support lower taxes. And if you have a higher income, you don't want those taxes to be like put on your income. But comparatively, Democrats support higher taxes and a larger social safety net. So if you're low income, you might get benefits from like the government if you support Democrats. So like those are things that like we can understand why those characteristics like match up with a certain party. When we look at race, when we look at Black and Hispanic Americans, they tend to be more likely to be Democrats, and white Americans tend to be more likely to be Republicans. When we look at blue-collar workers, we usually see Democrats, and for white-collar workers, usually see Republicans. If your parents are Democrats, you're probably a Democrat. And if your parents were Republicans, you were probably a Republican. And so when we look at the age breakdown, younger and older Americans, so like at the 2 ends of the spectrum, we tend to see those being Democrats. But in the middle, we tend to see middle-aged Americans identifying as Republican. And married people tend to identify as Republican, and single, widowed, and divorced people tend to identify as being a Democrat. And so when we see that there are like these huge breakdowns of like demographics and people that share a specific trait identifying with a specific party, it's really important to understand like why that is, right? And so when we look at like the next section, which talks about political ideology, it's going to become more clear. So before we do that, I have a question for you guys. What other traits do you guys think could influence a person's like identity and how they identify on the political spectrum? So once again, feel free to just drop your answer in the chat. Okay, so Jean-Paul says interest groups? Yeah, so like if you like are part of a specific interest group, like for example, if you are someone who's like in a like minority group, then that's how you identify, right? And so the party that's more likely to like champion your beliefs is going to be the one that you identify with. So let's look at this question. So Cheyenne asks, can you go into more detail about the role race plays in political socialization? And when did African Americans shift their support from the Republican to the Democratic Party? Okay, so let's talk about that. So this is something that's like actually, when you look back at like AP US history, so like remember Steve's where the Republican and the Democratic Party like pretty much flipped platforms, right? And so we saw that like Democrats became more likely to like champion civil rights and like, have a more progressive view when it came to things like race, right? So that was when we saw American support for like the Democratic Party like increasing. And so because at that point they had like flipped platforms, they were pretty much still like identifying with what used to be the Republican Party, because during the Civil War, the Republican Party was the one that was keeping the Union together and fighting to like abolish slavery. So technically, it was this parties, it was just that everyone, each party. So that's like pretty much how this your second question happened. But when we talk about like the role that race plays in political socialization, it can be something that's like a little bit tricky because, okay, for example, when we think about it, look towards specifically white Americans, right? So a lot of times when we look towards white Americans, what we see happening is that they identify with someone that like looks like them, right? So that's something that's like completely normal. You're very likely to have more of a positive view of someone that looks like you. And so it's very easy for people who have been here and have been like the majority population for a very long time to like begin to sympathize with views that sort of like fearmonger and like blame other people, right? So see people in like a specific party talking about how immigrants are like coming to the country and like trying to like take what they have and what resources they have. That's like a way to like employ race and get it into a specific like political identity. But when we look at people like who are African American or Black, we can see that they tend to agree with people who like want to champion their rights. So they're more likely to identify with a party that does so. And so that has largely been the Democratic Party for like the past few years and like decades. And so that's how can influence political socialization and how people like agree with a specific party. So also, if you grow up in a community that is like, for example, like a majority Black community and like the majority of people in your community identify as Republicans, you're very likely, because of your entire community, to also grow up voting Democrat, right? So that's how race plays into political socialization. So if you have a follow-up, feel free to like ask another question, but that's pretty much how we cover that. Okay, so let's talk about political ideologies. So the way that political ideologies are largely like defined are, the first one is conservative. So in America, the Conservative Party is pretty much the Republican Party, because people who identify as conservative, they tend to like smaller government, lower taxes, and like a lack of regulation of guns. So they don't want the like government intervening with people's like lives, and they're like, just stay out of our business, right? And so they also believe that discretionary spending is something that the private sector should deal with. So discretionary spending is things like Medicaid, Medicare, and like healthcare, stuff like that. And so like also like larger education funding, something that like the federal government doesn't really have a role in. So like state governments and local governments should have the majority of control over what's happening in their area. And so they also tend to have traditional views. So that's things like having prayer be allowed in school and being more patriotic than other groups that are across the political spectrum. So the party that we largely identify as the conservative party in America is Republicans, because they like smaller government and like lower taxes and that. And so we also have another ideology that is like pretty, I want to say common in America, but I don't think a lot of you have seen the Libertarian porcupine, so what can I say? So libertarians like smaller government and things like lower taxes. So on things like government and regulation, they tend to agree with Republicans where they want laissez-faire capitalism, so like hands off and like the government doesn't really interfere. And so they oppose government interference in personal, family, and business decisions. And so they want to focus on people's individual liberties. So people should have the right to do what they want, when they want, and as long as they're not hurting anyone else or taking anyone else's liberties away, they should be allowed to be free and make their own decisions. So this is the idea of non-interventionism. And so when we look at libertarians, the nuance between like Republicans and libertarians is that libertarians tend to be a little bit more liberal on social issues. And so when they think about individual liberty, they also think people should be allowed to like live their life the way that they want. So we're conservative that there is treated government as the liberal party. And so that's because people who are more liberal, they tend to agree with big government because they view the government as a vehicle. Wait, Cheyenne, is it still frozen? Wait, Cheyenne? Oh, okay, well. Oh, okay, so everyone is good. Okay, so the party that we identify as the Liberal Party in America tends to be Democrats. And that's because, I'll just go over in case Cheyenne missed anything. So big government, because they view the government as something that's like, should be used as a tool to solve issues. So that's things like regulations, right? The reason why we have a lot of regulations, and this ties into like the last point, is because, for example, like we might want to make sure that there's not a lot of pollution happening in people's water, right? So we might have regulations that say that companies can't dump chemicals into other people's water, right? So that would make a lot of sense. And so they view regulations as something to protect other people. So people who identify as liberal also might support taxes because they view something like the progressive tax as having like higher taxes on people who are more wealthy is something that the government can use in order to help other people who don't have as much money. And so they're using government power to help groups. So people who are like marginalized, people who are like, for example, like lower income and like have been discriminated against, the government is like a tool to help solve all of that, right? So we see liberals making sure that like having, if we have a big government, it's like used as a tool to like solve issues, right? So this brings us to today's question. Which party is the Liberal Party in America? So this is just a little review of the slides that we've talked about. And so feel free to drop your answer in the chat like we've been doing. And so, okay, Sandra says Democrats. Cheyenne also says Democrats. Okay. So yeah, we tend to identify the Liberal Party in America as the Democratic Party. And so knowing that, what we're going to like understand is that you guys should take away from this stream is that the major agent of our political socialization is our family, because our families have the biggest influence over who we are as a person. And so we tend to view them as people who are more like correct than other people. And also because they're pretty much like the only influence we have in our early lives. So from like when you're born to like when you first go to like school, the only people that you're really talking to is your family. You're not really like going and consuming news or anything like that. So if you guys have any questions, this would be the time to ask them. So like click ask a question and like type your question there, just drop it in the chat if that's like more convenient for you. But yeah. Okay. And so seeing that there don't seem to be any more questions, I will just end this stream here. Okay. Thank you guys for tuning in. It's been great. And so also thank you for interactive and stuff. That's always a great experience. So yeah, bye. Have a great day. Hope you guys all have a great Friday. Okay, Jean-Paul says, what is gerrymandering? Okay, so gerrymandering, right before we like, no, you're good, you're good. Okay, so gerrymandering is the idea that you like break down. Okay, gerrymandering is how we get districts, right? So say that you like have a square like area. And so say you have like everyone on this side is a Republican and everyone on this side is a Democrat, right? So one way that you could like gerrymander this like box, this imaginary box, is like if a line that like cut the Republican like party in half and kept all of the Democrats in like one box, you would get this like weird like Tetris shape, right? Like it would be like an L-shaped district. So in that like one box, you would have like more Democrats in this box and like less Republicans in this area. So you would end up getting a Democratic district. Yeah, Cheyenne pretty covered it. Political gerrymandering is when a particular political party uses their power to draw districts that favor their party in elections. Yeah, that's pretty much a really good way to sum it up. It's something that's like used all across America. So both Democrats and Republicans gerrymander. So gerrymandering is like how they split up different districts and get them to like help their party get the majority. So in like a lot of different states, even if Democrats get more of the popular vote or Republicans get more of the popular vote, another party might end up getting more of the legislative seats. So it's pretty much how like they guarantee their power. And that's like how it's been used in like modern times. So yeah, if you guys have any questions. Oh, Jean-Paul asks, would I go over the Electoral College or do I not have time? Okay, don't even worry about it. I have tons of time. Okay, so the Electoral College is this idea that every state gets like a different number of votes. And so the way that like a state like gets a particular number of like electoral votes is based on their population. So every 10 years we have the census, and so like those electoral votes are like reproportioned. And so candidates only like really focus on the states that are like swing states. So like there's a lot of states that like we generally know are going to vote a particular way. And so because the Electoral College in a lot of states has a winner-take-all system, swing states are states that sometimes vote Republican and sometimes vote Democrat. So Florida is a big example of that. So candidates tend to only really focus on things on like states that are going to flip one way or another. So they don't like go like really campaign in states like New York, right? Because if you're like a Democrat, you know that that's a safe seat for you, so you shouldn't be wasting your time there. And if you're a Republican candidate, you know that it's probably going to vote Democrat anyway, so it's a waste of your resources. So instead, candidates go to states like Florida that have both a lot of electoral votes and is a swing state, and like they're able to try to flip that one way or another. And so once they get all of those electoral votes, it's added to their like total. And so you have to pretty much just get 270 electoral votes or 271 electoral votes to win the election. So because states have like this winner take all system, even if someone gets like 49% of the votes, it doesn't matter. Like all of that state's electoral votes still go towards the candidate that like won the entire state. And so some people are like trying to change that. And so some states have done it so like you get how many electoral votes you like actually won in terms of like the popular vote, but that's not the general system. So yeah, if you have any more questions, now's the time to ask them. Yes, the electoral vote is what like is actually like counts. Like the popular vote, like for example, we've had like 2 recent cases. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the electoral vote, but Donald Trump won the she won the popular vote, and Donald Trump won the Electoral College, and so he became president. And then in 2000, the same thing happened where Al Gore won the popular vote, but George Bush won the Electoral College. Yeah. Yeah. Any more questions? So why is there a popular vote? Because figure out a way to give out electoral votes. Like states can't just be like, oh hey, by the way, like who's gonna make that decision, right? Because like it might be the legislators who make the decision, and like people, what's the purpose of the popular vote? To decide how like electoral votes will like go. So if like we didn't really have so like if 50% of people in like Florida vote Republican, all of those votes will go towards the Republican. And so if 50% of people in Florida vote Democrat, all of those like total votes will go to the Democratic candidate. And so pretty much the reason why we have the popular vote is to decide who's going to get those electoral votes. Yeah. Any more questions? What is the McGovern-Fraser Commission? I actually don't know that off the top of my head. I'm sorry. Yeah. So any more questions, guys? What is a caucus? So a caucus is a group of people that come together and like they decide who the candidate is going to be. So Iowa has this thing called like a caucus, and like it's pretty much where a bunch of people get together and they like vote for who like the Democratic nominee is going to be in like Iowa. So like people will get a different like proportion of the votes that can be given out based on how many like people vote for you in the caucus. So it's not like an actual like voting system, but it's like pretty much how you decide a nominee. Like the party gets together and decides. Yeah. It's before primaries, right? So you usually either have a caucus or primary. So in Iowa they have caucuses, and so like in Texas we have like primaries. It like kind of depends on the different state because states have different systems, but generally it's one or the other. But like the party might have a caucus to decide who their consensus nominee is. Yeah. Any more questions? What's the PAC? So a PAC is a political action committee. And so, yeah, it's not like one thing. It's like a bunch of different political action committees. And so like people like form them in order to like get something done. And so they have like a specific purpose. So there's this one like political action committee in Texas that like specifically like represents like young people. And so these political action committees oftentimes, Jean-Paul Fentes asks, are they like minor parties? No, not really, because they don't like have candidates and they're more focused on like raising awareness for a specific issue or like getting like in like giving money to specific candidates. So like they function like with parties, but they aren't like not parties. So like PACs can like support Democrats or PACs can like support Republicans, but they aren't like, they're not like the ones that are like part of the party system. They're like, yeah, they're just awareness groups. Yeah. So any more questions? What is incumbency? So incumbency is when you have held office before and the person running against you has not held office before. So for example, Donald Trump is the incumbent candidate for the 2020 like presidential election. And so whatever Democratic nominee and whatever Libertarian or Green Party nominee stands up against him, they are not the incumbent because they have not been the president before. Any more questions? Okay. Oh, party coalitions. So that's just when different parties like come together and like work together on something or in something. So like you can have inter-party coalitions where like specific like Democrats agree on an issue and like another group of Democrats doesn't agree on that issue and they feel another way. So that's like an inter-party coalition. And so sometimes like you have like party coalitions that are in between across the aisle. So you might have Republicans and Democrats come together and work together. So it's just like a way of like forming a group that like can actually get things done. What do the lobbyists do? So lobbyists, they pretty much like get Congress people to vote on legislation the way that they want to happen. So like people who are pharmaceutical lobbyists, for example, might lobby that Congress doesn't tax pharmaceutical companies as much, or that Congress like has less regulations on pharmaceutical companies. So yeah, that's what lobbyists do. They try to get Congress people to like agree with their companies and their views. Yeah. Any questions? What is what is malapportionment? I don't know that one off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure it might be like giving out like representation not based on like actual population, but yeah, that's one that you like want to double check. Yeah. Okay, any more questions, guys? What about party realignment? That's when like pretty much parties like realign based on like different views. So realignment is when you like change things or like move in different directions on different like politics or positions. And so party realignment is when like they change their views or like, yeah. Any more questions, guys? Visuals and politics. I don't know what you mean by that. No, you're good. I mean, yeah, I don't know what that, like, visuals in politics, like, visuals about what? Oh, okay, it's a term on your guide. So, like, yeah, I'm not sure what your teacher means by that. Sorry. Okay. So, any more questions? Okay, so seeing none, I hope you guys have a winner take all system. So that is like the Electoral College we talked about earlier. So some states, like say Texas has like 10 like electoral votes, which number it has. Okay, so if Texas has 10 electoral votes, right? And say like 49% of people voted Democrat, but 51% of people voted Republicans. They wouldn't split those electoral votes based on how many people voted each way. The Republican candidate would get literally all of the votes. So all 10 votes would go to the Republican candidate, even though like 49% of people voted Democrat. That's the winner-take-all system. Okay, any more questions? What about the plurality system? That's when there are a lot of different political parties. So we kind of only have a system that's like dominated by two political parties, Democrats and Republicans. But if it was like if there was more plurality, there might be like other like political parties that have more power. So like in different countries like England or in Canada, they have like a bunch of different parties that are vying for control, not just two. Okay, any more questions? What are splinter parties? So splinter parties are like pretty much just like mini parties that form off of like the Democratic, or not just the Democratic Party, any major party. So like, for example, when you look at like the Republican Party, a splinter party might be like if, like, for example, like Tea Party Republicans had decided to like form a different party of their own, like a little mini party, then that would be a splinter party. And so it's pretty much when like for example, the Republican Party like had a bunch of people that agreed, right? But then there was this group like the Tea Party that was like a little bit more conservative than like the general conservative was. So they like pretty much like formed their own like version of a Republican. But if they had decided to leave the Republican Party as a whole and like form their own group, that would be a splinter party. Oh. Are nominating conventions for caucuses? Caucuses are for nominating conventions. So yeah, so like a caucus is like pretty much like people of like same political party get together and talk about who the nominee should be. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, so it looks like there aren't any more, but I will wait a couple seconds in case one of you has one. The Federalists. Okay, so the Federalists were the party that at the very like beginning of America's founding were in support of the federal government being strong. And so Federalists felt that like the Articles of Confederation had been flawed because there was a weak national government. So Federalists felt that power should be like not concentrated, but like the federal government should like actually have ways to do things, as opposed to anti-federalists. States should have more power than like the federal government. So Federalists supported the Constitution and its ratification, and anti-federalists were against that. Okay, cool. Yeah. So what is direct mail? I've never heard that term before. I'm going to be completely transparent. Oh, for voting? Okay, so sometimes, so people can like mail in their ballots. That's like, yeah. So you don't have to physically go to the polling place. You can just mail in your ballot. So some states, like, that's just the norm, and everyone votes early because they vote by mail. Yeah. Jacksonian Democrats. So Jacksonian Democrats are pretty much people who like Democrats like fully supported Andrew Jackson and like agreed with his like political ideologies. And so like Andrew Jackson was like very much someone who believed that the federal government should like be used to like under Jackson, like for some backstory on him, he was like someone who grew up poor, and he became like someone who was more like influential because of his career in like the military, right? So when Jackson was president, he like, because of his influence and like the way that America was like trending in terms of democracy, like there was a lot more expansion in like people's rights, and more people were able to vote. So yeah, he was also super like racist and like pretty much caused a huge genocide of Native Americans. So he wasn't all great, obviously. Yeah, that was the Trail of Tears. He did that. What is a split ticket? So a split ticket is pretty much when you are like voting for, wait, okay, time out. I'm the terminology confused, so I'm gonna make sure. So a split ticket is when you have like this like one person on the ticket like has a different political party than another person on the ticket. So like if you had a Republican and a Democrat on like the same side of the election, that would be a split ticket. So we generally don't do that anymore at all. Yeah. When did split tickets happen? So like sometimes in like the primaries, like it's okay. So split ticket voting is actually when like people like it's the person choosing a Democrat and a Republican on their own ticket. So it's not when a Republican and a Democrat run together. Like, sorry, that was me misspeaking. But it's when like someone votes for like, they're like, we want a Democrat for governor and a Republican for the lieutenant governor, but we want a Republican for the president, and we want a Democrat for our like House of Representatives representative. So that's a split ticket. And so people can choose to vote split ticket whenever they want to, but a lot of like times now people vote straight ticket. So they'll just be like, we're voting all Republican or we're voting all Democrat. So that's the difference between a like straight ticket and a split ticket. Yeah. Any more questions? Who are super delegates? So when we come to like nominating a nominee for like the like for example the Democratic nominee, like each state gets a certain amount of delegates, and their vote is pretty much proportioned based on how the state votes. But there's also these people called super delegates, and so they're these like secret people who are like chosen by the Democratic Party, and they can vote however they want to. It doesn't really matter how like the popular vote goes. So they're like immune, and so they have like a little bit more of they have more autonomy when it comes to voting for the nominee. Yeah. Okay, so any more questions? Yeah, they're part of the political elite. Okay, so any more questions? Or a factional party? So a factional party when there's like is like when there's like a bunch of different like groups under one group. So like you know how we talked about how if the Tea Party Republicans had left the Republican Party earlier, it would be a splinter party. Well, because the Tea Party Republicans stayed within like the general Republican Party, that's a factional party. So like even though there's like a lot of different Republicans, there's like this faction of Tea Party Republicans, there might be a faction of like moderate Republicans, and so that's what a factional party is. Any more questions? Yeah, they're pretty much little parties within a party. Any more questions? So like, also to like clarify, they are factions within one larger political. So yeah. Grassroots lobbying is, okay, so traditional lobbying relies on like pretty much like these people who are earning like a lot of money lobbying for like companies, right? So grassroots lobbying comparatively is like when like normal people go and like they talk to their representatives, and so they might lobby for an issue. And so it's like where normal people are going and advocating, as opposed to like people who are advocating for like companies and stuff like that. Any more questions? Okay, so seeing no more questions, I will just say I hope everyone has a happy Friday and has a great rest of their night. Oh, okay, so C-SPAN is where Congress like live stream all of their like hearings and stuff. So it's just like, oh, you're totally fine. Don't even worry. Okay, so like C-SPAN is like Congress's like channel. Like if you turn to C-SPAN, it's just like a bunch of like different like hearings that are happening, or like if there's testimony from like someone in the education department, or like the Secretary of State is deciding to testify, it would all be broadcasted on C-SPAN. So it's like pretty much how like the average person can like tune in and see what's happening in Congress. It's like reality TV for Congress, but a lot less interesting than reality TV. But yeah, when like sometimes comedians go and they like talk to people about something, like Hassan Minhaj went to like lobby about student loan debt, it was like all broadcasted on C-SPAN. What are routine stories? I've not heard that term in terms of AP government. Yeah, sorry. Okay, any more questions? It's supposedly related to mass media. I mean, off the top of my head, I would assume routine stories are things that like are covered often. So like they're not out of the norm. But I don't know the definition off the top of my head, so yeah. Any more questions? Do you know what a trial balloon is? No, I don't know what a trial balloon is. Okay, any more questions? Party press? Wait, party press or like party prez? Like short for president. Press. Okay. So yeah, okay, so party press. Yes, like president, like short for president? Pressing a button. Okay. So party press is pretty much just like stuff that's put out by like the party. So like if the Democratic Party press, or like it's pretty much like stuff that comes directly from the party. Yeah. Any more questions? What about the adversarial press? So it's press that covers an event and a party in like a bad way. So it might like critique Democrats or critique Republicans. But like comparatively, party press can also be like stuff where like the like they're talking to a specific reporter and being like, hey, frame this thing this way. Any more questions? the Federal Communications Commission. So the FCC regulates like things like ads and stuff. So like the FCC might like, it also like regulates like ads during like the election and stuff. So the Federal like Communications Commission might, oh, by the way, you can't have profanity that's not bleeped from this time to this time because children tend to be watching TV at this time. So yeah, that's what the FCC does. What is Amicus Curiae? So amicus, I can't say that word for the life of me, but it's Latin. And so what it's like pretty much means is that it's a law term, right? And so it's pretty much a brief that's like put together. And so like an amicus brief, for example, is a brief that's like put together in the court to like, if they don't know a lot on like a certain issue, it might like provide like background and stuff. So an amicus curiae is like an advisor that's impartial and they're just like advising like the case in the court. It's not like biased or anything. So that is an amicus curiae. Yeah. What is soft money? So soft money is a term that is used when we look at like campaign funding. And so when we look at that, it's like pretty much not going to like a specific candidate. It's just like going into this like pool. And so like people will make decisions about where it goes. So you're not really like deciding who the money is going to. It's just going to like, for example, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And like from there, it's going to be like doled out how it will be. And so like oftentimes like PACs use soft money and like they will decide where money goes if you choose to donate to one or something like that. What's hard money? So hard money is money that goes directly to a candidate. And so like hard money, they can pretty much do whatever they want with it. And like it goes directly to, yeah. Any more questions? The 26th Amendment. Okay, I don't have the 26th Amendment memorized off the top of my head. I can tell you the 19th Amendment granted right to vote, but I don't know the 26th Amendment off the top of my head. I'm so sorry. What was the Citizens United case about? So I'm not say about this. Okay, so Citizens United was a case that pretty much said that like companies can donate money to like political candidates and like people as they want to. So it pretty much allowed for like more dark money to flow. So there was like less like focus on like people donating like money, and like now companies can like donate a whole bunch of money to like a specific political party if they choose to do so. Any more questions? You said dark money. So like, okay, dark money, like this, it's this idea that it's like money that's not really like, you don't really know where it came from. So they don't have to like disclose who like the specific person that donated it was. So it's like considered dark money because it's like in the dark, in the shadows. Haha, money from the black market? No, it's not from the, like, okay. It's from like people that like don't want their identities. Okay, you're just joking. I was like, not that. Can you explain the iron triangle? So the iron triangle is this idea that we have like this, there's three main like people when it comes to policy making, right? There's like, first we have congressional committees, then there's like the bureaucracy, and there's interest groups. So like the iron triangle pretty much says that those are the three main factors that like decide how policies are made. So like so like when we look at congressional committees, like they pretty much decide like whether the bill is going to get out of committee. So they have to agree with like interest groups. And so interest groups are advocating for a specific point of view. And so the third leg of that like triangle is the bureaucracy. And so they're the ones that like actually implement the law and like, yeah, that's how policymaking works. It's about how like laws are implemented and passed. And yeah, that is the iron triangle. Any more questions? The necessary and proper clause. So the necessary and proper clause says that the federal government can make laws that they deem necessary and proper. And so it like is a little bit allows for elasticity when it comes to like them making laws. And so that's actually going to be the last question I can answer for tonight, because there's another like streamer that is scheduled to start. So that being said, thank you everyone for tuning in to this AP government stream. Like you guys can go ask questions on like Fiveable. Have a great day.